Welcome to ChinaX office hours for week 42. I'm Peter Bohl, and here with me is Adam Mitchell.
Hello, hello.
And Adam, we have to tell people this is actually the final part 10 of ChinaX.
End of a very long journey.
A very long journey. So a few more weeks still to go. But you have been absolutely a wonderful, wonderful group of people to have with us. Now, we should tell you, though, particularly for those of you who are still looking at earlier modules, that when Part 10 comes to an end, we're going to pull ChinaX because we're going to be working on ChinaX 2.0, which is going to be a very different set of things. And so if you do want to do earlier modules at this point, do them now, because they will be off the air pretty soon. Now, you know, this week we had 3 really interesting speakers.
Very distinguished professors.
Very distinguished.
Professor Elizabeth Perry.
Elizabeth Perry in politics.
Dwight Perkins in economics. And Ezra Vogel.
Sociologist. Right? And they shared their research and perspectives, and a lot of you really enjoyed it. Some of you shared your New Year's resolutions, and you can see those now on the screen. Now, we had a large number of questions, Adam, this week. One question was, will China de-Maoize like Soviet Union de-Stalinized?
It depends on what you mean by de-Maoize. In some ways, China of today it could not look more different than China of the Maoist era.
That's what I thought, yeah.
Economically, politically, it ostensibly still has the same system, but the level of regional experimentation, special economic zones and everything have fundamentally reshaped the economic and, in some sense, the political landscape.
So it has been de-Maoized already in that sense, at least
in that sense.
In terms of the excesses of the Maoist era.
But at the same time, you'll see Mao statues everywhere. You'll see, people still sometimes sing red songs in parks.
Sure. Somebody wrote in and asked about housing conditions and how much space people had in their Mao versus how much space they have today, and how it compared, let's say, with Beijing or Shanghai compared with New York City or San Francisco. And you said you had actually looked something up here?
Yeah, I'd looked this up before, actually, for fun, just comparing Beijing and Shanghai to New York City. And the biggest difference that you see between, say, Beijing and New York City is the income to the price of the house ratio, how much people make a year versus the total cost of a house. In New York City, it's about 9. So people's annual income is about 1/9 of the total price of the house. In Beijing, it's 33. So in other words, it takes 33 years of income on average to purchase a house. It's enormous. It's enormous. There's a funny thing.
How does anyone ever afford it?
You hope that your family has money and they pull together.
Yeah, it's still 33 years.
There's a really famous.
That's like a mortgage.
Right. There's a famous thing on the Chinese internet that talks about if you want to buy an apartment in Shanghai and you're a farmer, then you had to start farming in, I don't know, the Song dynasty, basically, in order to be able to buy one.
Yeah.
But the housing prices are roughly equal. So the housing prices in New York City and Beijing are about the same. The only major difference is that the rent prices in New York are 2 to 3 times as high as Beijing.
Right. So we had an interesting question also on the merit system through examinations in China, and things like the gaokao, which admits you to the university, and they'd like to hear more about that, and I think they will.
Yeah, so the gaokao has a really interesting history. It was actually was created at the very beginning of the PRC in 1952. It went out for 10 years during the Cultural Revolution, and it was brought back in 1977. And there's a very famous class of people, the 1977 group, that were the first people to retake the exams, and in general, they've been extraordinarily successful in China. Ostensibly, it's a very meritocratic system, but there are a lot of regional inequalities. Each province administers the exam independently, and they have quotas. And some of these quotas are, in China, they kind of have a bit of notoriety. For example, students from Shandong have a very difficult time of getting into major universities. I just looked up the statistic. Beida accepts 1,800 people a year from Beijing, and it accepts 38 a year from Shandong.
This is this looks a lot like the traditional examination system, which favored the capital region as well.
Right.
We had a bunch more questions. We cannot get to them all.
Right.
Really, but I wanted to clarify some of the things that Professor Perry had said that people were concerned with. She said, for example, that nationalism or nationalisms and ethnic demands were a potential challenge for China. What did she mean by that? If you think of nationalism as an idea that there should be a government that represents people who have some kind of shared identity, you could imagine that Uyghurs might have Uyghur nationalism, Tibetans might have Tibetan nationalism. And so when ethnic identity and nationalism get combined, and of course there's this big nationalist movement within China proper, of the Han nationalism, one might say, it actually can create a lot of dissension and a lot of what Marxists would call splitism.
Right. Or I was in Xi'an during the Diaoyutai Island protests, and actually a major riot broke out in the city. Supposedly the protesters were originally encouraged by the government. They supposedly handed out banners and things for people to protest the Japanese control of the islands. But it became a full-scale riot with looting and pillaging and things like that.
Wow.
So these things can quickly become out of hand.
Get out of hand.
Right.
Also a question, what's the meaning of human capital in Professor Perry's discussion? What does human capital mean?
Human capital means the qualities that a human can have that can increase their efficiency, productivity, things like that.
Okay.
Really, she's referring here to education.
Okay. So educated people are part of the human capital of a country.
Right.
Okay. How centralized is the Chinese political system? Is there still local and regional experimentation? Well, that seems to be very much the case, right?
Right.
In fact, one of the challenges I know from my colleagues who work on climate change and energy environment is that the central leadership is very aware of the problems of pollution, but getting lower levels of government to enforce the laws is very difficult.
Yeah, so China has a very interesting system. It's highly authoritarian, but highly decentralized.
Right. It's very hard to figure out how that works. But I think what it means is that in political terms, that if the central administration is really concerned, they have the ability to crack down. Right? Although maybe not entirely through traditional means. Now we asked for some word clouds, and you're seeing the first of them on the screen. Here's a word cloud that was created by your comments based on the interview with Professor Vogel. What do you think the greatest contribution of Deng Xiaoping was? And as you can see, the word that comes up most often is?
Modernization.
And when we did a second word cloud, what's Deng Xiaoping's greatest failure? The word that comes up most often was?
There's a couple, but it looks like political reform, inflation, and democracy are about roughly the same size.
Right. Now, we asked for some short responses to the question, what do you think the greatest economic questions are facing China today? And we had some very erudite and thoughtful answers. One was from Bain USA Net, and he talks about rising wealth disparities and negative externalities. What does he mean?
So he's talking about economic inequality, this gap that's growing between people that have and people that don't have, basically. Especially people like rural versus urban inequality, people in the cities versus people in the countryside. When he's talking about increasing negative externalities, he's talking about economic systems which allow people to earn, to profit, but not the profits don't take into account the negative impacts they might have on other individuals. For example, factories along the river might just dump their things into the river, and it affects all the farmers downstream, but they themselves aren't being taxed to compensate the farmers for the damage that they're doing. So he argues that the problem of increasing negative externalities and rising wealth disparities are at the center.
And these negative externalities have a lot to do with the failure or success of government regulation.
Right.
Now, Suseno brings up a couple things. The greatest problems, corruption. And here's an interesting one. Second point that he makes is the propensity of consumers to save.
Yeah. So this is a much discussed issue that basically China needs to increase its domestic consumption, that they need to encourage people to spend more. And Chinese people are spending quite a bit. We learned the other day that Singles Day in China like blew Black Friday and Cyber Monday out of the water. So it seems that Chinese people do consume quite a bit. But for example, a lot of money is invested, especially in housing. So people will just buy apartments and then set on them. Maybe there's not even anybody living in it. But
although this is an interesting problem because as Marty 157,900 notes, that there are lots of housing estates that are built but are empty, or large infrastructural projects that are not fully used. So in some sense, they're building ahead of the market or building ahead of demand.
Yeah, it's kind of a build it and they will come mentality in many places. I've been to places in China where there's kind of ghost malls and things like that.
And Marty 157-900 thinks that this actually is a bigger problem than corruption, which I thought was interesting. Now let's move on. The bigger discussion this week was Deng Xiaoping's notion of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Do you agree or disagree with what he says, looking back now from the present, we ask? And how might China have developed differently if it had not taken the socialist path? That's a counterfactual question. I dislike counterfactual questions a lot, but Professor Kirby likes them. So there you go. Adam, what is socialism with Chinese characteristics?
So it's a highly amorphous term, and it, in some sense was intended to be a very amorphous term. But the basic idea is that Deng called for the creation of a socialist market economy, one in which would have a very large public sector. You have very large state-owned enterprises, but they're competing with one another. And he tries to, and basically the idea is to inculcate as many market mechanisms as you can, to have these big SOEs fight with one another.
SOEs, state-owned enterprises.
State-owned enterprises, compete with one another and also compete with a private economy. For example, one thing that they did was in the creation of big telecom companies, they would shuffle around the CEOs. So the head of one telecom will become the head of another telecom and things like that. And there's a lot of mechanisms in place to try to increase competition. And this was considered the initial stage of socialism. It's not pure socialism, which the party was achieving.
So socialism with Chinese characteristics meant some combination of private ownership and state ownership and greater competition rather than a purely planned economy.
Right, right.
Okay.
But like I said, it's an amorphous term. It's been heavily criticized. For instance, the MIT professor, Huang Yasheng, he calls it capitalism with Chinese characteristics rather than socialism with Chinese characteristics.
So we have a bunch of very thoughtful and long comments here. Scott Drux, can you pull out something from Scott's long comment?
Yeah, just a couple things. He says that Deng finally realized that Mao's economic policies had been a disaster to China, and he basically had to wait for Mao to die to do anything about it. I would say that I wouldn't say Deng finally realized Mao's disasters were a policy. He from the records we have and things, he was pretty aware of it early on, and he very much had a very different idea of how the Chinese economy should progress in the very earliest years of the PRC. But in some sense, it is true. He did have to wait for Mao to die in order to push for a very different reform. I don't think, with Mao living in, say, 1970, anyone would have had the power to say, okay, let's do socialism with Chinese characteristics and put market reforms in the economy.
Teo Hoa Kok says, capitalism could only serve individuals or elite interests, while socialism can channel equitable benefits to general population in large numbers.
It's a big statement.
Yeah, but I mean, in terms of purpose, I suppose that's what socialists would say, that they are going to be more equitable.
It is the rhetoric.
But capitalists would say, well, we raise all, a rising tide raises all boats.
Right.
Everyone's going to be better off. Which is what Deng Xiaoping was saying when some get rich first, right? In the 1980s, because that meant other people would get rich second. So Lunchboxer says, this kind of counterfactual history questions aren't a bit arbitrary. Like, of course, he says, we have no way of guessing what exactly alternative futures would be like. But he wants to comment on it anyway. Well, I still think they're arbitrary, but good. So what does Lunchboxer have to tell us?
He basically says it's very important to note the scare quotes on the word socialism in the question itself.
When you say scare quotes, what you're meaning, you mean that when you put quotes around a normal word, you're making people pay attention to that word and thinking that it doesn't mean what it says it means.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that?
That's what he's claiming. He's saying that socialism here isn't socialism at all, but in fact it's being used as a symbol to stand in for a very large number of ideas, but that are being ostensibly labeled as socialist.
So we have a comment from Edwin Borst as well.
He says basically the real question is whether or not Deng's statement matters. He said the statement that Deng is making is an overtly political one. he said he was part of this system. He is part of the Communist Party leadership, and therefore what he is saying is it should be understood as a statement from within that system. And of course, if you're in the system, you support it. So Deng has to prop up the system that he's in because it ultimately gives him legitimacy.
Sure.
And I think this is ultimately a good analysis. The idea that this brand, this socialism with Chinese characteristics, is kind of a claim to legitimacy. It allows the party to progress, it allows them to enact market reforms and do things differently, but yet still maintain the CCP. The CCP is still able to maintain its legitimacy to rule.
We also have A. Weirjo, who has trouble agreeing with Deng's statement, Deng's assertion, and makes the point that you've made that it's really it's uncertain, it's ambiguous, there's a lot of trial and error that goes on. And if it hadn't taken the socialist path, it's difficult to say. Not all democratic countries, he points out, have the same path, so maybe it doesn't depend entirely on the political path that's chosen.
And we talked about that a little bit, or as reference with the case of India.
And then we have K.Y. Tong, who points out that he was successful, Deng was successful in his economic reforms, but success, what lay behind it was not Marxism, actually, in K.Y. Tong's view, but actually totalitarianism, right? And this ability to be efficient through totalitarian government and pushing economic reforms, and he sees a parallel to Singapore and Taiwan, in the earlier periods. M.B. Wall talks about socialism, capitalism, communism as labels, and makes the point, which I think is an important point, that they are essentially ways of forming concepts. And credit that. And David Chow.
Yeah, he says for him, what Deng was doing, and the most important thing, was that he was keeping China together. That basically, after the Qing falls to the present day, China remains roughly the same in terms of its territorial expanse, and that is truly the key to China's success as he saw it.
Good. Well, thank you for joining us for Office Hours 42 in ChinaX, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you.